Good evening and welcome. As one of the founding directors of Sacristy Press, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this Durham Book Festival Fringe event, brought to you by Durham Cathedral and Sacristy Press. This is the second of three vibrant virtual events that we have for you this week, the first time ever that the Durham Book Festival Fringe has gone online. It's wonderful to be able to reach not just a regional audience, but a global one too, showcasing North East England's amazing homegrown literary talent and creative enterprise. So wherever you are around the world, welcome to Durham. Before I introduce this evening's guests, here is one of my Cathedral colleagues to say a few words.
Good evening. My name's Charlie Allen and I'm the Canon Chancellor here at Durham Cathedral. It is my privilege and delight this evening to be able to welcome you to this second in a series of 3 online talks as part of the Durham Book Festival Fringe. This evening we have the joy of the presence of Katharine Tiernan with us, and Katharine will be talking to us about legend and literature, the life and death of Cuthbert through fiction. St Cuthbert is of course part of the spiritual legacy of this landscape in the North East. There's always something more to discover about him, something afresh to find about his life and about his example on the way of faith. And Katharine brings alive in really wonderful ways the story of the saint and also the story of the people of the saint. I'm very much looking forward to the evening ahead, and I'm sure that you are too. Katharine, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Charlie. As we've just heard, Cuthbert is a name that reverberates deeply with many of us in this corner of the land. Some of you may have seen the huge Lego model of Durham Cathedral that sits proudly just outside the shop. A few years ago, while it was under construction, Sacristy Press sponsored a group of children from St Cuthbert School in Chester Street to build St Cuthbert Shrine in Lego. I'm not entirely sure what St Cuthbert himself would have made of this, but the children certainly enjoyed it, and my heart just melted when one of them exclaimed, "This is the best school day ever." And how could I argue with that? Photos from the day can be found on the Sacristy Press Facebook page. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Katharine Tiernan, who will bring the legend of Cuthbert alive for us this evening, albeit without any Lego. Kathy is the author of 3 wonderful novels which bring us face to face not only with Cuthbert himself, but with the people who followed him and the forces that threatened his legacy both in life and death. Tonight is the official book launch of Kathy's 3rd novel, A New Heaven and a New Earth, in which we discover the brutal treatment of the people of Northumbria and Cuthbert Shrine at the hands of William the Conqueror during the harrying of the North. It's a gripping story of violence, heartbreak and redemption, bringing the trilogy to a dramatic close. Kathy joins us from Berwick in the very far reaches of present-day Northumberland, and you'll be delighted to hear that her novels are all available from Durham Cathedral Shop or the Sacristy Press website. If you would like to ask Kathy any questions during the live broadcast, please do add a comment to the live stream on Facebook, YouTube or Twitter, and if technology permits, we'll put some of them to Kathy at the end. So, Kathy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Charlie, as well, for your lovely welcome, and to Durham Cathedral for making this possible. It's really wonderful to be here tonight, and another big thank you to all of you who have joined us tonight. It's really lovely to be here. And so as Richard has said, I'm up in Berwick, so welcome to Berwick and welcome to my desk where it all happens. Unfortunately, it's too dark at the moment to let you have a peep out the window, but you can see behind me a lovely calligraphy by a Berwick calligrapher, Arthur Wood, I've still got my head in the way, of St Cuthbert's pectoral cross in garnet and gold. So that's going to be our backdrop for this evening. When I told a friend recently that I was publishing another novel in this series, she said, "You must be very interested in St Cuthbert." I wasn't quite sure what to say. It's true, I am interested in St. Cuthbert, but it's not the whole story. I'm also interested in his tradition, the ongoing story of his community and how it influenced the North in ways that still resonate for us today. St. Cuthbert is identified with the North in a unique way. There's no other saint quite like Cuthbert in this respect. His nearest medieval competitor, Thomas à Becket, is identified with Canterbury, but it was never a major feature. But from the medieval pilgrims walking the sands to Lindisfarne, all the way through the centuries, to Durham miners carrying their colliery banners to the Cathedral for blessing, Cuthbert and his shrine has embodied the identity of the North in a way that transcends class and religious affiliation. So while the first novel of the trilogy, Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, is about Cuthbert himself, the two subsequent novels, Place of Repose and the new one, A New Heaven and a New Earth, are about the enduring relationship between the saint and the people of the North. If one wants to understand the North and its history, it is a unique lens through which to view it. That history now is no more than a footnote to the main story of England, but in the medieval period, the North was perceived very differently. It was a distinct and autonomous region, kingdom. This was particularly the case in the new novel, which is set in the Norman period. For most of us, the Norman Conquest is about 1066, the Battle of Hastings, Hereward the Wake, the Domesday Book, and we hear little about what happened elsewhere. But for the North, it was uniquely devastating. And that devastation is often forgotten in the general narrative. The North felt more connected to Scandinavia than it did to Normandy. Resistance in the North to Norman rule was intense and prolonged. It led to shocking reprisals, the most bloody of which is known as the Harrying of the North. St. Cuthbert and his community at Durham were in the thick of it. So, in some ways, this is a Northeast trilogy rather than a Cuthbert trilogy, although his presence is felt in all the novels. And maybe it's also the question, you must be very interested in the North. And that's true too. Northumberland is home to me. I grew up near sea houses in the landscape of the Cuthbert tradition. I was in Cuthbert House at school, and I went to St. Cuthbert's Church on Sunday. And in the happy days before mass tourism, we had picnics on Inner Farn in the summer holidays, and I saw Cuddy's ducks nesting in what I was convinced was Cuthbert's cell. But like most of my contemporaries, when I grew up, I moved away and went south. My present connection with the tradition began not in the North, but in a dark basement in the British Library in St. Pancras. I'd gone to see an exhibition of the Lindisfarne Gospels in all their amazing splendor. But what took my attention was a side exhibition of objects that had been taken from Cuthbert's coffin when it was last opened in Victorian times. There was what looked like a folding stool, which he used as an altar on his journeys into the remote communities of the kingdom. There was his petrol cross, as behind me, made of gold and red garnet, and there was a small brown book, his copy of the St. John Gospel. I was riveted. The man I'd known about since childhood stopped being a legend and became real to me. I felt as if he might walk in at any moment and pick up his things. I had a vivid sense of his presence. Afterwards, I was filled with amazement. How could this be? How could these things have been preserved through 14 centuries? The 7th century seems unimaginably far away, lost in the mists of the Dark Ages. How could it have felt so immediate to me? Writing the novels has been an exploration of both things, the presence of the saint and the survival of his tradition. Although I've spent much time on background research, there are just 2 primary texts. One is Venerable Bede's Life of Cuthbert, which was a bestseller right through the medieval period and, of course, is still in print today. The second is extremely obscure and only available in a facsimile edition of an archaic Victorian translation. It's the history of the church at Durham, written in the 12th century by Simeon, one of the monks in the new Benedictine order in Durham. They're both collections of stories. The first, by Bede, are stories about the saint, told and retold by his monks. The second, by Simeon, contains the epic stories of the saint's community, their stories about themselves, about their heroic devotion to a saint, about how they managed to preserve him through 4 centuries and 2 devastating invasions of the north. It is historically dubious, but emotionally gripping. The stories are wonderful. I hadn't meant to write a 3rd novel, but the stories around the Norman period are so amazing I couldn't leave them alone. So the unexpected answer to the question, how was the tradition preserved, is through stories. This is a talk about stories and how they played out over time and how we find the original stories starting to create a new narrative 4 centuries later. So, to begin at the beginning, we can say that if there hadn't been Bede, there wouldn't have been Cuthbert, or there wouldn't have been Cuthbert as we know him. He would have been another obscure name in the litany of Celtic saints, like Ebba and Kentigern and Ninian, vague, legendary presences. But something different happened with Cuthbert. The Venerable Bede was one of the great scholars of his day. He wrote game-changing treatises on the nature of time. He invented the AD and BC system of dating, and more commentaries on the Bible than you could shake a stick at. He was recognized and respected throughout Christian Europe. And Bede lived at Jarrow, in the same kingdom of Northumbria as Cuthbert, and just 50 miles down the road from Lindisfarne. He was only 14 when Cuthbert died, but the catalyst for the life came 11 years later, when the brothers of Lindisfarne decided to dig up Cuthbert's body in order to reverence his relics. They got a big surprise. Here's Bede's description. They expected to find the body, to find the bones quite bare, as is usual with the dead, the rest of the body having dwindled away to dust. They were going to put them in a light casket in some fitting place above ground in order to give them due veneration. But on opening the coffin, they found the body completely intact, looking as though still alive, and the joints of the limbs still flexible. It seemed not dead, but sleeping. The vestments, all of them, were not merely unfaded, but crisp and fresh like new, and wonderfully bright. The monks were filled with great fear and trembling. They could not speak, did not dare look at the miracle, and hardly knew where to turn. The episode has all the hallmarks of Bede's storytelling. It's dramatic, colourful, and vivid. The monks of Lindisfarne, realising they had a major saint on their hands, asked Bede to write up their collection of stories. Bede obliged, once in verse and once in prose. Many of the stories of the miracles would have become iconic, like the story of the sea otters who came to dry him after he spent a night praying in the sea. I'd like to read you another less well-known story that has resonances for us at this time of pandemic. Both Bede and Cuthbert had personal experience of the plague. Bede was one of only 2 survivors as a boy when there was an outbreak at his monastery, and Cuthbert had the plague as a young man and survived. This is taken from Cuthbert's time as bishop, when there was an outbreak of plague in the bishopric, and he went round visiting. At this time, the plague broke out and dealt such havoc that of great villages and estates, once crowded with inhabitants, only a tiny scattered remnant remained, and sometimes not even that. Our Most Holy Father, Cuthbert, went round the diocese with unflagging zeal, preaching and bringing much needed consolation to the few people left. In one village, he exhorted everyone he found and then said to the priest, "Do you suppose there's anyone left in the place who needs visiting? Or can I now move on to the next?" The priest looked all around and pointed out a woman some distance away who had just before lost one son and was now holding another, dying, in her arms. Her tear-stained face gave ample proof of both past and present ills. Cuthbert went up to her without delay, blessed the boy, and kissed him. "Have no fear," he said to the mother. "Do not grieve. The child will get better and live, and you will lose no more of your family." Mother and child both lived long afterwards, thus proving the prophecy true. When I first read Bede, it was both engaging and discouraging. The idea that I might write something about this person withered away. Bede had done it already, and how could you compete with Bede? I gave up on the idea of writing about Cuthbert, but I wasn't ready to give up on the theme entirely. It was at this point that the idea of looking at the history of the saint after death occurred to me. I discovered in Simeon's history the epic story of the community's 7-year flight from the Danes after the great invasion of 866. It was full of adventure, and the saint made frequent appearances through dreams and visions. It became the basis of my novel, Place of Repose. It is, chronologically, the second novel in the series, but in a back-to-front way, it was the first to be written. It was well received, and then I was encouraged to go back to Cuthbert's own story to try again. This time I was armed with a lot of new information. Professor Nick Hyam of Manchester University had just published a definitive history of early Anglo-Saxon Northumbria, focused on the very period of Cuthbert's life. It is immensely well researched and considered, and it was an eye-opener to me. Bede's Cuthbert is timeless and universal. He floats in a kind of divine ether, where earthly things are only background detail. The political and religious conflicts of the time are not mentioned, nor is Cuthbert's antagonist, his controversial contemporary Bishop Wilfrid. Nick Hyam's account explores all this background and gives a different context to Cuthbert's life. In the bitter conflict of his time between the Celtic and the Roman traditions, his Cuthbert emerges as both pragmatic and inspirational, a man who was able to reconcile and to lead his people. I saw there was scope for a novel that might combine the two, and so Cuthbert of Farne came about. Of course, Bede's life remains the touchstone. Its popularity was crucial to its survival. It meant that it was widely copied at a time before printing presses, when less popular works might only exist in a few copies. This was critical when the community was struck by the first major crisis of its existence. In 793, the first Viking raid on Lindisfarne sent shockwaves through Europe. Those attacks would continue for decades, and monasteries were an easy target for plunder and slaves. But in 866, an attack came that was no longer a raid. It was an invasion. The great army of the Danes defeated the Northumbrians at the Battle of York and became rulers of the kingdom. When the Danish war fleet sailed into the Tyne, the community decided it was time to leave. They took the saint's uncorrupt body, King Oswin's skull, and the Lindisfarne Gospels with them and hit the road. This is the period of the second novel, Place of Repose. As far as we know, they didn't pop a copy of Bede into the coffin, but it didn't matter. By that time, 200 years after Cuthbert's death, Bede's life in the lingua franca of Latin had been widely copied and circulated, both in the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and in Europe. It was Bede's fame and the quality of his storytelling that ensured the survival of the Cuthbert story. During the early decades of Danish rule in the north, the monastic culture of Northumbria's golden age was wiped out. Lindisfarne was left deserted, as was Bede's monastery at Jarrow. The great monastic centres at Hexham, Carlisle, Ripon and Tynemouth were all destroyed, and with them the monastic libraries. Christianity and the culture of the word was wiped out. If the life of Cuthbert had been the pedestrian work of a local scribe, it's likely it would have suffered the same destruction. But because it was the work of a famous author, it managed to transcend its local context. Cuthbert had become international, and this ensured the survival of the life. In the next phase of the story, Bede's influence was to be even more remarkable. After the 7 years of wandering, the community was settled first at Chester Street, where they were endowed with all the land between Tyne and Wear, as well as their Lindisfarne estates. Throughout that period, they were the sole surviving monastic institution in the north. Late in the 10th century, the community moved to Durham. Somewhere along the line, the monastic tradition got lost, and by the time the Normans arrived, Cuthbert's people were a married community, with the priesthood being passed down from father to son. The 7 senior priests of the community were direct descendants of the 7 loyal monks who attended on St. Cuthbert during the years of exile, and they took great pride in their inheritance. But when the Normans came, things threatened to fall apart. First of all, the Normans were, in general, contemptuous of all things Anglo-Saxon, including their saints. Several minor cults got dumped and were replaced by continental saints. When William the Conqueror visited Durham, he was highly sceptical about St. Cuthbert's claim to incorruptibility. He demanded that the coffin be opened, and he declared that he would have all the senior clerics put to death if it proved untrue. But first he would have supper. It must have been a nervous meal. Fortunately, the saint intervened directly. William was afflicted with a burning fever so intense that he leapt from the table and, calling for his horse, galloped out of the city, never to return. We have to assume that William had not read Bede, but the bishop he appointed to Durham had. Bishop Walcher was a cultured man from Liège who had made it his business to do some background reading before he arrived. Walcher read Bede. When he arrived in Durham, there was no further debate about Cuthbert. He was a major saint. The process of Norman takeover of the cult had started. Meanwhile, there was an even more extraordinary development. A monk named Aldwyn, prior of Winchcombe Abbey in Gloucestershire, happened to take Bede's life down from the bookshelves one day around 1070. It had an electrifying effect on him. He saw in a vision that he was called to revive the true religion of the early church that Bede's writing described. Not only to revive it, but to revive it in its home in the north. He failed to persuade any of his fellow monks to join him, except for a young deacon and a Norman knight who wanted to do penance for his bloodshed. The 3 men set out to walk to Northumberland from Gloucestershire, taking with them a donkey to carry the mass vessels. They were walking through a country at war, through the devastation left by the harrying of the north, which had seen every home and village between York and Durham razed to the ground. They just walked through it with the donkey. Eventually, they got to Jarrow, Bede's old monastery. Jarrow, by this time, was a complete wreck. It had been raided by the Vikings, and what the Vikings had left untouched, the Norman armies had finished off. Here is Simeon's description. They took the monastery of the Blessed Apostle Paul, which had been erected at Jarrow by its former abbot, the unroofed walls of which alone were left standing, and they exhibited scarcely any vestige of their ancient dignity. Upon those walls, they reared a covering formed of unhewn timbers with hay upon them, and there they began to celebrate the divine service. Beneath the walls, they erected a little hovel in which they slept and took their food, and thus they sustained, by the alms of the religious, a life of poverty. There, for the sake of Christ, they took up their abode in the midst of cold and hunger and the want of all things, they who might have had every abundance in the monasteries they had deserted. In the meantime, many persons were influenced by their example to abandon the world, to accept from them the monastic garb, and become the soldiers of Christ. So it was a revivalist community inspired by Bede's vision of Cuthbert's austere spirituality. Even more amazingly, it was to play a crucial role in the reinvention of the Cuthbert community at Durham. Men came to join Aldwyn, and soon there was a primitive community of monks at Jarrow. When the second Norman bishop, William de St. Calais, wanted to get rid of the hereditary priests of the community, he replaced them with Aldwyn and his brothers. The new community was not Norman, it was anglo-saxon and directly inspired by Bede. What was originally a record of the past had become an imagined template for the future. Simeon, our storyteller, was one of Aldwyn's monks. He has a vested interest in the new order at Durham and little sympathy with the displaced married clerics. They were given the choice, he tells us. They could join the new community only if they renounced their wives and became celibate. Only one of their number did so, the dean, persuaded, Simeon tells us, by his son, who had joined Aldwyn's order. Simeon, of course, commends the dean. But when I read it, I thought, what about his wife? What happened to her? How could she be just discarded like that? The misogyny of the Normans is the most hateful part of their influence on the cult, which has nothing to do with the original Cuthbert tradition. So part of a new heaven and a new earth is the wife's story, Edith's story, and how she came mysteriously to be the inner heart of the new cathedral. The novel has three voices: Edith, the dean's wife; Aldwyn, the visionary mystic; and a third, a man named Thorgot, the Anglo-Norse adventurer taken hostage by the Normans. When I came across Thorgot's story and Simeon's history, it was hard to believe that no one had written about him. It's a story of the you couldn't make it up kind, full of adventure and extraordinary coincidence that eventually were to bring him to Durham. But Simeon's history of the Norman period is not just a ripping yarn. It demonstrates an inner continuity with the spiritual inheritance of St. Cuthbert that is easy to miss. From the outside, it seems as if the tradition of the people of St. Cuthbert came to an end with the Normans. The hereditary community was disbanded, the Saxon church was pulled down, and Norman bishops took over. But we learn from Simeon that appearances are deceptive. The monks who took over at Durham weren't Normans, they were Aldwyn's monks, inspired by his vision of an original pure Christianity brought to Northumbria by Aidan and embodied in the life of St. Cuthbert. And the man who oversaw the building of Durham Cathedral, Thorgot, and became its most influential prior, was not a Norman either. It was Thorgot the adventurer. He was Anglo-Norse and a favourite of the King of Norway before he was brought mysteriously under the influence of the saint. Through an intensely turbulent time that brought great suffering to the north, the inner heart of the tradition was preserved. These stories are part of the inheritance of the north. They tell us about the issues that mattered intensely to our forebears and which still resonate for us today. They explain how it is that we can walk into Durham Cathedral and stand at the tomb of a saint who died 14 years ago, why we can still see the remains of his original coffin, his travelling altar, his gospel book. It's why it seems important to me to keep telling these stories, and why I have wanted to write this trilogy. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'd like to finish, if I may, by reading a short section from the start of the novel. As I say, we have 3 narrators, and it's Thorgott who starts us off. Yes, I am Thorgott. It has often been tut-tutted at for a pagan name, but I pay no heed. My mother was Norse, that's all, and that was nothing unusual in the Danelaw. There were more Danes and Norse in Lincoln than English. And if it seems a far cry from the Danelaw to Durham, why, that's the story I'm here to tell. I grew up speaking Norse, but my father wanted me to be a scholar, so English it was. By the time I left the Minster School, I could read and write in Latin and English, reckon out a row of figures, and order a melody into parts and harmonies. I was a ready scholar, but the monks were more interested in my voice. A voice like an angel, they said. I had to sing at every endless service when I would rather have been down at the ships with my father. I hoped it would come to an end when my voice broke, but no, better than before. I knew the Psalms by heart, hymns, liturgies, all of it. It was to be my salvation, though not in the way you might expect. When Duke William and the Normans came along, it was nothing to us. We'd had Danish kings, Saxon kings, now a Norman king. What difference would it make? Lincoln was a snug little port, far enough inland to be out of reach of raiders, and if you were wide awake, there was money to be made. My father was shrewd. He'd made enough from the ships to buy an estate for himself, and by the time I was 20, there was land for me as well. In the spring of 1068, William arrived in Lincoln on his way back from the fighting in York. The alderman turned out to greet him and brought out provisions to give him a feast. We were used to it. We lived on the crossroads of the kingdom. There was always some princeling passing through, and the Lincoln merchants tried to keep on the right side of whoever looked like being in power. We gave hospitality to William and showed him the town. And that was our mistake. As soon as he set foot in the upper town, built where the Roman fort had stood, he had eyes for nothing but the view. It was a clear day, and from the top of the escarpment, you can see for miles. He'd ridden down Ermine Street from York. Now he could see the endless line of it stretching southward with hardly a bend to London. And to the west, the Fosse Way unrolled just as the Romans had left it. Then and there, I do believe, William's mind started scheming. 2 months later, he sent a detachment of soldiers into the town, and the word was that he would talk with the Witan. Now, my father sat on the Witan, not I, but he sent me in his place. I persuaded him. I thought he was too cautious. I was 20 years old and so full of myself, I thought I could see off the Normans single-handed. I was to pay the price for my arrogance if I had not been so full of my own opinion. I might yet be an alderman myself and cantor in the new cathedral. It was a trick, of course. The Normans had no intention of talking to us then or now. We walked into the Witan Hall like songbirds into nets. William's man, Fitzrobert, sat at the high table with papers before him and clerks around him. We never doubted he was there for counsel. For sure, the hall was full of armed men, but that was the Normans. Everyone knew they never took off their helmets. His clerks took down our names and our land holdings, and when that was done, we sat on the benches. When the last man's name was taken down, Fitzrobert looked up and nodded to his soldiers. It all happened in a second. 4 soldiers grabbed me, roped me, and pulled my arms tight against my body so I could scarcely draw breath. The hall was in chaos, men struggling, and the Normans shouting at each other in French. I was tied up with the other men, so we were forced to move in line. They pushed us out of the hall and into the street. And that's the start of the novel, where Thorgott is taken hostage and where the story begins. So I hope very much that you will read the rest of it. And thank you again so much for being with me and with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, and a huge congratulations on the release of your new book, which is a wonderful accomplishment and no doubt a massive relief too. On which note, is this definitely the last?
There's a question, Richard. I don't think I'm quite ready to give an answer yet.
Fair enough. Do please send your questions in. We've had 1 or 2 via social media, but we're happy to receive a few more. When we first posted this event on Twitter a few days ago, someone replied asking, wasn't Cuthbert a top misogynist? I hasten to add that's their words, not mine.
Well,
was he?
I would really like to lay that accusation to rest. I think if you just take your mind back to the story I read from Bede at the start of his talk about him visiting the plague village and how he responded to that woman holding her dying baby, I think it's rather difficult to accuse him of being a misogynist. And when you read Bede, I think there are more stories about Cuthbert interacting with women than men. And he had many female friendships, many women who clearly loved him. And the origin of a misogyny tradition, I'm afraid, is the Normans. When they decided they were going to get rid of the hereditary priests, the married priests, they claimed that St. Cuthbert would only tolerate having monks near him, that he couldn't bear to have women anywhere near him. And they started all these stories, which are completely apocryphal, of things that Cuthbert is supposed to have said and done, showing that he hated women. And if you've been into Durham Cathedral, they even built a line in the pavement over which women were not allowed to step. So they really wanted to keep the women away. But that has nothing to do with St. Cuthbert and everything to do with the Normans.
Absolutely. A question here from David Grieve, who posted on YouTube. Wonderful that you couldn't leave the story alone and had to write this novel. We agree, incidentally, David. If the story can be, as it were, greater than the event, is a saint's sainthood more than his or her actual life?
That's a really interesting question. I think I don't think I would use the word more or less, really. I think Cuthbert was very well loved in his lifetime and recognized for his holiness. And the qualities that made Cuthbert a saint during his lifetime, I'd like to think of the qualities that have continued. And they are qualities to do with love and compassion, and that he has been that presence for his people, that the people of the North have felt his presence as their protector.
Thank you. And another social media question from David Tomlinson. Catherine, did you have your own sense of Cuthbert's presence as you wrote?
People do sometimes ask me that, and I'm not sure. I I feel inhibited about claiming to have Cuthbert sitting on my shoulder, you know, and I sometimes wonder why, but you know, it has come about that I've written these novels, and I hope that Cuthbert thinks they're okay.
Excellent. What made you pick the quote from the Book of Revelation as the title for your new novel? For anyone who has a memory as short as mine, that title is A New Heaven and a New Earth, which I think is Revelation 21.
Oh, very good. Can I read you just a little bit more of the quote to put it in context? Then I saw, this is, okay, so this is the revelation of St. John the Divine. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of the heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And it goes on, and there are two things to say about it, really. When they were building Durham Cathedral, the masons drew very strongly on biblical sources to guide the architecture of the cathedral. And there's a lot of evidence that Revelation provided some of this material. And in the bit I've just read, it talks about the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And they saw the building of the cathedral as being the new Jerusalem descending, and used some of the actual physical measurements that are quoted about Jerusalem in the Old Testament to base the sacred geometry of Durham. So in the latter section of the novel, there is quite a lot about the building of Durham Cathedral, just the planning and the early stages. So the title in part is a reference to that. There's also a sneaky little reference that St. John the Divine sees the church as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. So in the midst of all this misogyny, they actually see the church as a beautiful woman. And there is a correlation with Edith in this regard, not to give any of the plot away. And finally, it does also talk about God's dwelling place is now amongst his people, and he will dwell with them. And that in some way there was a consolation in all of this, in the building of the cathedral, for the terrible suffering that the people of the North had experienced.
So maybe this question follows on quite nicely from Ben Jenkinson. What are the lessons from the story of St. Cuthbert for the North and Northumbria today?
I think St. Cuthbert's wisdom really is a perennial wisdom. When I was writing this novel, I was often struck at the parallels between that time and today, and what people turned to in Cuthbert then perhaps is the same for us today, to those qualities of compassion, of reconciliation that are very important for us today.
Why do you think only one of the married priests joined the new community? As far as your novel's concerned, was it, as we would like to believe these days, that they didn't want to leave their wives, or was there perhaps a more cynical reason?
There was so much at stake for them, really. I think in the novel, I try to present a complex picture of how the community was. There's no doubt that they had a spiritual commitment, but it is also true that they had become powerful and influential landowners, because the community had been, over the centuries, given a lot of land. And so they had vested interests, if you like. And marriages, for example, we discover that the Earl of Northumbria marries off one of his daughters to a member of the community because it was seen as a good marriage. So they did have some quite worldly interests. And if they left Durham, they were given a reasonable living, whereas if they stayed, they would be expected to lead the same ascetic life that Baldwin's monks were leading. And of course, they would have to leave their wives. So it was a tremendously painful decision. And some of the drama of the novel revolves around that decision.
It's a period in the history, I think. Just a little comment here from Irene Young. Thank you for your talk and introduction to your new novel. And Joyce Middleton says, absolutely enthralled. Thank you so much. And if I can find it, there was a comment from David Grieve, another one from David Grieve here. This year of pilgrimage in the diocese hasn't happened yet, really. For those who don't know, 2020 was supposed to be a year of pilgrimage for the Diocese of Durham, and indeed, I think, for the wider church beyond. If you were coming to Durham on pilgrimage, where would you start from?
Well, it would have to be Lindisfarne, of course. I wanted to quote, I don't know if any of you remember a little book by Michael Chaplin. He was commissioned by the Durham Book Festival to write a book in memory of his father, Sid Chaplin, a great writer of the North. And it was very delightful to me that when Michael Chaplin wrote this very nice book for the Durham Book Festival, it starts in Lindisfarne, and guess what? It finishes at the Saint's Shrine in Durham. And this is a writer who doesn't have a particular religious commitment, but again, he sees the North as Lindisfarne to Durham, encapsulates that spirit and identity of the North associated with Cuthbert.
Absolutely. How do you treat the thin line between fact and fiction, both when you're writing your novels and when you're considering your sources, such as Bede and Simeon? Is this part of the fun, treading that thin line? And do you think maybe that writing historical fiction about real people and real places somehow distorts the past?
It's a real minefield, this area, because people will always have different views about historical characters. The bottom line is none of us can know what another person thought and felt. You can only take a flying guess at it from circumstantial evidence, if you like. And I'm particularly fortunate in that I'm writing about people who most people don't know much about, so people don't have many preconceived ideas. I've got to admit that I do my background research and then I jump in and I let as a writer, I let the characters develop. And it is, I know many writers say this, but it is as if they start to take on a life of their own and they speak with their own voice. And I don't have too strong a sense of imposing my own views and identity on them. But of course it is a completely personal and fictional view.
Absolutely. On that note, I think we're going to wrap up the questions. Thank you, Catherine. They've been absolutely fascinating. And if, like Pat Francis here, you're all now eager to rush out and buy Katharine Tiernan's novels, all three are available from the shop at Durham Cathedral. But if you can't make it to Durham, they're also available for worldwide delivery from Sacristy Press at sacristy.co.uk/DBF20. If you've enjoyed this event, please do share it and follow both Durham Cathedral and Sacristy Press. On Friday, we're joined by Francis Ward from Cumbria and Jenny Wilson from Australia to talk about what it's like to live with eco-anxiety and how the church can be at the forefront of the climate debate. And if you missed it, don't forget to catch up with last Monday's fascinating live broadcast about Marxism and Christianity. Before we go, I would like to offer a huge thank you to our colleagues at Durham Cathedral who have supported this event, and not least to Clarissa, who's been sitting behind the scenes making sure we all appear on the screen at the right moment. Sacristy Press is proud to be the only publisher based in Durham and the only publisher from the Northeast to be taking part in the Durham Book Festival, and we're truly grateful for your support, not only by watching this evening, but also by reading our books and supporting our wonderful authors. On that note, many thanks also to Katharine Tiernan, our wonderful guest this evening. Thank you for watching. Good night.